November 333 BC. Two empires stand face to face. On one side, Alexander of Macedon, young, daring, with eyes set on conquest. On the other, Darius III, ruler of the vast Persian Empire, surrounded by thousands of soldiers. In moments, one of history's most decisive battles is about to begin. In the early autumn of 333 BC, the political and military landscape of the ancient world simmered with both anticipation and dread. Alexander, newly crowned King of Macedon, had risen to the throne only a few years earlier, following the assassination of his father, Philip II. Since then, he had shown impressive military prowess, defeating his enemies with precise tactics and a charismatic leadership that inspired his soldiers to follow him to the edges of the known world. For Alexander, the campaign against the Persian Empire was more than a mission of territorial expansion. It was vengeance for centuries of Persian invasions into Greek territory. After securing vital trade routes and subduing various cities, including Miletus and Halicarnassus, Alexander marched eastward with a clear objective: to confront the legendary army of Darius III. Meanwhile, Darius III, ruler of a vast empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the heart of Asia, saw Alexander as a young and impulsive threat who could not be underestimated. Determined to preserve Persian dominance, he mobilized his generals and assembled an impressive army to crush the Macedonian forces. Darius knew that his throne and the future of his empire hung in the balance. Thus, under the promise of glory and conquest, Alexander's army advanced through eastern lands, while Darius amassed his immense forces. Separated by hundreds of miles, these two leaders were destined to meet in one of history's most decisive battles, a true clash of titans that would alter not only the course of their lives, but also the trajectory of Western and Eastern civilizations. As the campaign progressed, Alexander faced the challenge of coordinating his men, routes, and supplies in a hostile land. With keen strategic insight, he decided to split his army. He sent Parmenion, his trusted general, north to secure control over inland territories and to protect their supply lines. At the same time, Alexander led the main march along the coastal route, consolidating control and staying close to both resources and local allies. The Macedonian army, comprised of disciplined phalanxes, light infantry, and a formidable heavy cavalry known for its brute force, was well coordinated and agile, despite being outnumbered by the forces Darius was gathering. Alexander understood that to counter his numerical disadvantage, he would need speed and precision and complete control over communication routes. Each conquered city became a strategic foothold, reinforcing his presence and demoralizing the Persians, proving that the Macedonian advance would not be easily halted. While Alexander methodically advanced, Darius to the west assembled forces from across his vast empire. He summoned allies and reinforcements from distant regions, forming a diverse contingent that included Median, Persian, Babylonian soldiers, and Greek mercenaries. This diversity promised a multifaceted force, yet integrating these distinct units and cultures posed a challenge. Aware that a divided empire would be vulnerable, Darius personally oversaw the recruitment and organized alliances, seeking to unify the empire against the threat posed by the conqueror from the west. Amid these preparations, both leaders directed their forces towards Cilicia, a narrow mountainous region linking Asia Minor to the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius hoped that his massive contingent would prevail through sheer force, while Alexander crafted a strategy to engage in the confined terrain, where his organization and tactics could potentially overcome the Persians' overwhelming numerical superiority. As they drew closer to the Cilician lands, Alexander understood that he was not simply marching toward an ordinary battle. Every move and every city conquered along the way represented more than military victories. They were demonstrations of his strategic prowess and persuasive power. For Alexander, this advance was as much a conquest as it was a clear message to Darius and any potential Persian allies that the Macedonian army was an unstoppable force. However, the Persians were not unprepared. Under Darius's command, Persian strategists laid out intricate plans to halt the Macedonian force. Unlike many of his predecessors, Darius had decided not only to send his generals, but to personally lead the army, taking an active role in battle to boost his soldiers' morale. He understood that Alexander relied heavily on the loyalty of his troops and the speed of his operations. Thus, Persian strategy focused on breaking this confidence and drawing Alexander into a battle of attrition, where his numerically smaller army might be forced into a defensive stance. Darius surrounded himself with trusted advisors, including Greek strategists familiar with Macedonian combat tactics. One of the key pieces of advice he received was to utilize his vast contingent in open terrain, where numerical superiority could be maximized. To this end, Darius planned to lure Alexander into a battlefield that would favor the use of his heavy war chariots, one of Persia's deadliest weapons, especially effective for creating breaches in enemy lines. On the Macedonian side, Alexander studied the terrain as he advanced, planning routes that would give him an edge against Darius's maneuvers. Intelligence reports indicated that the Persian army was diverse, but possibly vulnerable due to a lack of cohesion among its troops. With this in mind, Alexander devised a tactic relying on the disciplined strength of his phalanxes and the shock power of his heavy cavalry. He understood that a well-executed formation could withstand even war chariots, and his strategy centered on limiting the Persians' mobility by forcing them into terrain that would make it difficult to outflank or scatter his forces. As both armies drew closer to Cilicia's borders, soldiers on each side felt the weight of what lay ahead. For the Macedonians, Alexander promised a historic victory that would resonate through the ages. For the Persians, Darius was the bastion of resistance, a symbol of an empire that would not bow to foreign invaders. The Battle of Issus would not unfold on wide, open plains. Instead, the narrow, mountainous terrain of Cilicia presented significant challenges for both armies. The region, surrounded by mountains, limited mobility, funneling troop movements into confined paths, a setting Alexander had intentionally sought to neutralize the Persians' numerical advantage. When Darius advanced with his troops and found Alexander positioned in the narrow valley along the Pinarus River, he immediately recognized the difficulty of maneuvering his massive forces. Yet confident in the sheer size and endurance of his army, Darius chose to maintain formation, trusting that the vast numbers and resilience of his soldiers would still secure victory. The Persian army, an impressive array of diverse troops from across the empire, stretched along the valley, with each contingent bearing unique weapons and combat styles. Among them were the Persian Immortals, Darius's elite guard, positioned for direct confrontation with the core of the Macedonian line, ready to crush any resistance. On the opposite side, Alexander deployed his forces with precision. He understood that the narrow valley would force the Persian army to crowd together, limiting their movements and hindering the formation of effective flanks. He positioned his sarissa phalanxes, their long spears transforming their formations into walls of sharp points at the center of his front line, while his heavy cavalry stood ready on the flanks to counter any Persian attempts to advance. Alexander knew that his cavalry's superiority could prove decisive. His plan was to use them to break through the enemy lines quickly, creating panic and disorder within the Persian ranks. As dawn broke, the two armies stood face to face, the early silence carrying the weight of the soldiers' fears. Each soldier understood that, as they lined up, their fate now depended on the skill of the leader before them. Alexander rode through his ranks, greeting his men with confidence and determination, strengthening their loyalty and trust in his leadership. Across the field, Darius, in his elaborate war chariot and surrounded by his personal guard, watched the Macedonian lines with keen eyes, certain that Macedonian resistance would soon crumble. Everything was set for a collision that would decide more than victory or defeat. This battle would shape the future of two empires and their leaders. As the silence gave way to the first commands, the battle began. Positioned at the front of his heavy cavalry, Alexander ordered the advance of his phalanxes. The Macedonian soldiers marched in flawless formation, their long sarissas raised like a forest of spears, ready to face anything in their path. The discipline of the phalanxes was their greatest weapon, a cohesive formation advancing like an impenetrable wall, carving through the terrain as they pressed toward the Persian lines. On the Persian side, Darius watched the Macedonian advance and immediately ordered his forces to push forward. With an extensive line filling the valley, the Persian army advanced in waves, with infantry units and archers launching projectiles toward the Macedonians, attempting to disrupt their ranks. As the armies collided, the impact was brutal. Soldiers on both sides engaged in close combat, the clash of weapons mingling with shouts and the dust stirred by the onslaught of troops. Confident in his numerical superiority, Darius took a risky move. He ordered the Persian cavalry to sweep around and attempt to flank the Macedonian lines. But Alexander had anticipated this maneuver and, with a precise signal, unleashed his own cavalry in a powerful counterattack. Mounted on powerful steeds, Alexander's companions charged swiftly and decisively at the Persian flank, catching the enemy cavalry off guard and forcing them into a retreat. This maneuver briefly disrupted Darius's lines, but he held his ground. Determined to break the Macedonian force, Darius ordered his war chariots to surge through the center, aimed directly at the heart of Alexander's phalanxes. The Persian war chariots, fitted with blades on their wheels to slice through enemy lines, were designed to breach formations and create chaos. However, Alexander had prepared his troops for this threat. Instructed to open gaps in their formation to allow the chariots to pass through, the Macedonian soldiers avoided direct impact, reducing the effectiveness of the chariots and minimizing casualties. As the battle raged on, Alexander saw an opening on the field. He swiftly rode along the right side of his formation, leading a fierce cavalry charge to strike directly at the Persian left flank. This precisely executed and brutal assault began to sow panic among Darius's troops, forcing them to retreat and weakening the integrity of the Persian lines. The combat grew more intense by the moment. Alexander directed each maneuver with speed and accuracy, his eyes scanning every detail and ready to adjust his strategy as needed. Meanwhile, Darius, from his war chariot, watched as the Macedonian phalanxes pressed ever closer, and his initial confidence began to give way to uncertainty. With his left flank weakened and his forces disorganized, he realized he faced the possibility of catastrophic defeat. As Alexander intensified his assault on the Persian army, particularly on the left flank, chaos began to spread among Darius's soldiers. The Persian formations, once orderly and confident, started to break apart under the relentless charges of the Macedonian cavalry and the unyielding advance of the phalanxes. Alexander's disciplined, tactically precise forces were opening cracks that threatened the stability of the entire Persian line. At the heart of the battlefield, the Persian elite, including the renowned immortals, fought fiercely to hold the line and counter Alexander's advance. However, the cohesion of the Persian army was dissolving. More and more units moved chaotically, unable to withstand the concentrated power of the Macedonian forces. Recognizing that the decisive moment was near, Alexander led a direct charge toward the Persian center, aiming for the position where Darius, from his ornate war chariot, was overseeing the battle. For Darius, the situation was quickly becoming untenable. He could see his forces wavering and the Persian line on the verge of collapse. In a critical moment, Alexander drove forward with a calculated, relentless push toward Darius's position. A bold maneuver intended to deliver the final destabilizing blow to the Persian command. Sensing the imminent danger and realizing the battle was lost, Darius made the decision to retreat. Darius's withdrawal had an immediate and devastating effect on the morale of his troops. The sight of their king fleeing the battlefield sparked panic among the soldiers, who began a disorderly retreat. Persian officers and generals struggled to restore order, but the king's departure delivered a fatal blow to the army's cohesion. The hierarchical structure that had held the massive force together unraveled, and the dispersal of troops accelerated. Without Darius's leadership and facing the determined onslaught of Alexander's forces, the Persian resistance finally collapsed, and Alexander's victory was assured. With the Persian forces scattered, Alexander and his men advanced to Darius's abandoned camp. There, amid the treasures and luxuries left behind in the king's hasty retreat, Alexander found a striking display of the Persian Empire's power and wealth. The camp, laden with carpets, ornaments, and invaluable items, along with ample provisions, was a symbol of Persian opulence. Among these possessions were Darius's mother, wife, and daughters, captured by the Macedonians during the king's desperate flight. Showing uncommon respect toward the defeated enemy's family, Alexander ordered that they be treated with dignity, ensuring they would come to no harm. For Alexander, this gesture was not merely a matter of honor, it was also a calculated diplomatic strategy. He understood that by respecting Darius's family, he would strengthen his image as a fair and benevolent leader, a conqueror who honored the traditions and values of those he subdued. Word of this act spread quickly, beginning to build the respect that many Persian subjects would come to hold for the young Macedonian king. News of the victory at Issus and Darius's humiliating escape spread swiftly across the Persian Empire, shaking the morale of the king's loyal forces and sparking murmurs of discontent. The defeat made it clear that Alexander was not merely a skilled military leader, but a brilliant strategist who had, with a smaller army, overcome the most formidable power of the time. The psychological impact of this victory was devastating for Persia. Alexander had not only dismantled Darius's army, but also shattered the aura of invincibility the empire had cultivated over centuries. After dividing the spoils among his soldiers, Alexander solidified his reputation as a fair leader, further strengthening the loyalty of his troops and encouraging his officers to see in him a commander with visionary greatness. For Alexander, the victory at Issus was not the conclusion but the beginning. He knew that the path ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but the triumph at Issus had laid the foundation for his reputation as an invincible leader. Development. The victory at Issus was a turning point, not only in Alexander's military career, but also in the history of the ancient world. In a single battle, Alexander not only defeated Darius and his forces, but showcased to the world the strength and discipline of the Macedonian army. His triumph was so remarkable that many of Persia's allies and subject peoples began to view Alexander as a possible liberator or a rising monarch. Even Alexander's enemies, upon hearing of the battle, started to regard him as a figure destined for greatness. This victory had a devastating effect on the Persian Empire. With his defeat, Darius lost not only a significant portion of his troops and resources, but also his grip on the cities and territories of Asia Minor. Many cities, recognizing the empire's vulnerability and Alexander's military prowess, began to open their gates to the Macedonian king, offering alliances and even surrendering without resistance. Alexander capitalized on these events to consolidate control over these lands, expanding his influence and smoothing the path for future campaigns. Internally, Alexander began to envision his destiny as far greater than that of a mere conqueror of Persia. He saw himself as a leader who could unite East and West under a single rule. Inspired by this vision, Alexander began adopting elements of Persian culture, showing respect for local customs and integrating Persian officials and soldiers into his army. This gesture was seen not only as practical diplomacy, but also as a declaration of his intent to become a universal ruler. However, the victory also brought new challenges and ambitions. Now, with much of Asia Minor under his control, Alexander planned to march into the heart of the Persian Empire, aiming for legendary cities like Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. His triumph at Issus marked the beginning of this new phase of his campaign, a phase of glory, but also of trials that would test the limits of his leadership and his army. For the Persian Empire, the Battle of Issus was an irreparable disaster. With Darius demoralized and in retreat, many Persian nobles and governors began to question the king's ability to protect the empire and even considered secret alliances with Alexander's army. The collapse of Persian authority signaled a turning point in the power dynamics of the time and set the stage for Alexander's rise as the greatest conqueror of his era. With the crushing victory at Issus, Alexander not only defeated the Persian army, but began to shape his destiny as a ruler who would challenge the known borders of the world. The battle showcased the complexity of his strategic genius and cemented his reputation as one of the greatest military leaders of all time. His next steps would be even more ambitious, and with the confidence of one who believes himself destined for a greater mission, he prepared to conquer the most powerful cities of the East. On his journey, Alexander would not only face new challenges, but would also redefine his role as a leader. The siege of Tyre, his next major campaign, would demand not only military might, but also unique strategic skill to overcome natural barriers and seemingly impenetrable walls. If you wish to follow this captivating journey, subscribe and enable notifications for the next episode, where we'll explore Alexander's siege of Tyre, discover the bold tactics and crucial decisions that helped the young Macedonian king overcome one of the greatest challenges of his life. Join us as we dive deeper into history, uncovering how Alexander continued to build his empire and shape the course of civilization. For those interested in the secrets of leadership, strategy, and power, Alexander's story is an enduring testament. At every step of his campaign, he teaches us not only about war and conquest, but also about human ambition and the desire to achieve the impossible. The battlefield of Issus, soaked in glory and blood, was only the beginning. Alexander still had much to accomplish, and his journey would not end as long as there were lands left to conquer.